7825, code 6, 105 North Avenue.
Please help me. My husband wants to kill me.
On a November evening in 2009, a neighbor in Apollo Beach, Florida heard screams and saw something that would haunt them forever. A woman, covered in flames, had just escaped through a garage door. The smell of gasoline hung thick in the air. Her husband, a former New York City police detective, stood nearby holding an empty gas can. What happened in those moments would leave Audrey Mabrey with burns covering 80% of her body. But the real question is, how does a man sworn to protect and serve become someone capable of this? Keep watching to find out. Welcome to True Crime Archive. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe. When first responders arrived at the home on November 17, 2009, they found Christopher Haney, age 46, with a story that would soon unravel. But Audrey Mabrey, despite devastating injuries, was conscious and she could tell them exactly what happened. To understand this day, we need to go back 9 months, to the moment Audrey discovered a secret that would set everything in motion. This wasn't about a sudden rage, this was about control slipping away. Audrey Mabrey was 29 years old in 2009, a mother of 2 young sons. She had met Christopher Haney years earlier when he was still working as a detective for the New York Police Department. Friends described Audrey as warm, devoted to her children, and someone who always saw the best in people. She had put her own education on hold to support her husband's career and raise their family. In March 2006, Christopher Haney moved to Florida permanently. Taking a job as a security guard, Audrey found herself increasingly isolated, relying on him for everything as the sole breadwinner. But in the fall of 2009, Audrey made a decision that would change the trajectory of their marriage. She decided to go back to college, but Christopher didn't support this. He wanted her to remain a stay-at-home mother. Christopher began exhibiting jealous behavior, becoming protective and territorial, especially about Audrey's male friends. He never showed violence during this period, but the possessiveness was growing. Then came the discovery that would break everything open. In September 2009, Audrey found out that Christopher had taken out loans, multiple loans. He had a gambling problem she hadn't known about. He'd gambled away their savings and was now borrowing money just to continue. For Audrey, this was the final breaking point. She asked for a divorce. Without money for her own place, Audrey and Christopher made an agreement. They would continue living in the Apollo Beach home together from September until December. Then she and her sons would get their own apartment in Brandon, Florida. For 2 months, they maintained this fragile arrangement. On the surface, things seemed civil. They were co-parenting, sharing space, working towards separate futures. Audrey had even secured an apartment in Brandon. She and the children would occasionally stay at the Apollo Beach house when it was more convenient for their schedules. But for Christopher Haney, the reality of losing his wife, his family, and his control was becoming unbearable. According to domestic violence experts, one of the most dangerous times for a victim is when they try to leave. The abuser feels they're losing everything, and people who feel that way are capable of anything. November 17, 2009 would prove that theory devastatingly correct. What Audrey didn't know was that morning would be the last normal morning of her life. November 17, 2009 started like any other day. Audrey dropped her 2 children off at the babysitter so she could attend her college classes that morning. After class, Audrey had time before work. She decided to stop by the Apollo Beach house for a break and go for a run to clear her head. The neighborhood was quiet, the Florida sun was warm, everything felt routine. But when Audrey returned from her run on November 17, 2009, her estranged husband was waiting. What happened next would be captured in her testimony to police, to nurses, and later to a courtroom. Don't forget to subscribe and also turn on that notification bell. Audrey later described how she was greeted by Christopher Haney holding a butcher knife. He forced her into the garage. Inside that enclosed space, away from neighbors' view, Christopher's rage erupted. He first attempted to sexually assault her. When she resisted, he picked up a hammer. Christopher struck Audrey 4 times in the head with the hammer, then he reached for something that would turn this from an assault into an attempted execution, a container of gasoline. Why gasoline? Why fire? Domestic violence experts say the method reveals something about the psychology of the attacker. Christopher doused Audrey with gasoline, then he picked up one of her scented candles, cucumber melon, and tossed it in her direction. Audrey would later tell reporters, "I thought I was going to die that day." The flames engulfed her instantly, she suffered burns over 80% of her body. But Audrey Mabrey did something extraordinary in that moment. Despite her horrific injuries, she managed to activate the garage door. That automatic door rising would be what saved her life. A neighbor spotted her and immediately dialed 911. Christopher Haney stood in the driveway, still holding the gas can, and according to witness testimony and Audrey's own account, he simply watched her burn. When sheriff's deputies arrived minutes later, Christopher Haney would tell them a story, but it was a story that wouldn't hold up, because Audrey Mabrey was still alive to tell the truth. Audrey was rushed to Tampa General Hospital with burns covering the vast majority of her body. Medical staff described her injuries as catastrophic. Doctors placed her in a medically induced coma. Her parents, Richard and Lisa Brown, received a call in Texas from a plainclothes police officer. Richard Brown would later recall that he initially thought the officer was an intruder and tackled him in the yard before understanding the devastating news. It took the Browns 2 days to get a flight to Florida. When they arrived at the hospital, they found their daughter unrecognizable, but even in her critical state, even sedated and fighting for her life, Audrey had already done something crucial. Before being placed in the coma, she told hospital staff exactly what happened. She told them her husband had attacked her, beaten her with a hammer, poured gasoline on her, and set her on fire. Meanwhile, at the scene, Christopher Haney was telling investigators a very different version of events. Haney claimed that he had been the intended victim, that his wife and an armed, masked accomplice had tied him to a chair and put a gun to his head. He said Audrey threatened him with the lit candle and a bottle of gasoline. According to Haney, he kicked at Audrey to defend himself, the gasoline spilled, and she went up in a fireball. It was an elaborate story, a self-defense claim, but there was just one problem. The physical evidence didn't support any of it. Deputies found no signs of anyone else at the scene, no rope marks on Christopher, no evidence of a struggle consistent with his story. And there was something else. Christopher Haney had written a letter after his arrest, a letter of apology to Audrey. But come to think of it, why would a man who claimed self-defense apologize? Audrey remained in her induced coma until Christmas 2009, 6 weeks unconscious while her body tried to heal from unimaginable trauma. Christopher Haney was arrested and charged with attempted first-degree murder, aggravated battery with great bodily harm, and first-degree arson. The case against him was building. He had made conflicting statements, the defensive story to deputies, but also admissions of guilt in the letter and according to testimony from responding officers. But would a jury believe the word of a former NYPD detective, or would they believe Audrey? When Audrey woke up in December 2009, what she saw in the mirror would become a defining moment, not of victimhood, but of an unbreakable will to survive. In December 2009, Audrey Mabrey woke up after 6 weeks in a coma and felt completely lost. What she found in the mirror was devastating. "What I saw in my reflection was Freddy Krueger," Audrey would later say. "To be quite frank, the way God had designed me to look, I was never going to look that way again." Second and third-degree burns covered 80% of her body. She would endure 7 surgeries during her hospital stay. Her 2 young sons needed their mother. Her parents stayed by her side, and somewhere, in a jail cell, her husband was preparing his defense. But Audrey says it was on that same day, looking at her changed reflection, that she discovered the power inside herself. She had a message for Christopher Haney, a mental promise: he would not win. Audrey spent 3 months in Tampa General Hospital recovering from her burns. The home in Apollo Beach was a crime scene. Christopher controlled their finances and Audrey's medical bills were mounting. Julie Weintraub, founder of a charity called Hands Across the Bay, stepped in to help. The organization provided Audrey with an apartment, furniture for her and her children, and Weintraub personally gave Audrey a car to drive. Without this support, Audrey and her sons would have been homeless. The days, months and years that followed were filled with painful surgeries, depression, and then determination. Audrey enrolled at Hillsborough Community College. Her mother said she wanted to study psychiatry. She was rebuilding, not just physically, but emotionally and practically. As Audrey fought to heal, Christopher Haney was making his own moves. From jail, Haney wrote Audrey a letter begging for forgiveness. He told her he loved her more than ever, that she was still beautiful, even with her scars. Prosecutor Jennifer Gabbard described this as an attempt to manipulate his wife. It was a pattern survivors of domestic violence know well, the cycle of violence followed by apology, followed by promises to change, but Audrey wasn't falling for it anymore. She was preparing to face him in court and she had something to say. Let's think this for a moment. Would a jury convict a former police officer on the testimony of his burned wife, or would they believe his self-defense claim? Let's find out. Christopher Haney's trial began in January 2012, more than 2 years after the attack. His defense attorney, Jennifer Spradley, urged jurors to look beyond Audrey's visible scarring and focus on evidence that she claimed proved her client was not guilty. Mr. Haney never intended for this to happen, Spradley argued, suggesting that if he had truly wanted to kill his wife, he would have succeeded. Haney's grown children from a previous marriage attended the trial, supporting their father. The defense painted a picture of a man defending himself against an attacker, but then Audrey took the stand. Audrey Mabrey, age 29, testified about what happened in that garage on November 17, 2009. She told jurors her husband had been jealous of an ex-boyfriend. They were divorcing but still sharing custody of their 2 small children. She described how Christopher forced her into the garage when she stopped by the marital home, how he tried to rape her, how he struck her 4 times with a hammer, then threw gasoline on her and used one of her scented candles to set her on fire. The courtroom was silent as she spoke. Her scars were visible, her voice was steady. Family and friends said Audrey's main fear was that Haney would be acquitted and would attack her again. Then the prosecution presented evidence that would seal Christopher Haney's fate. Prosecutor Jennifer Gabbard told jurors that to believe Christopher Haney's story, they would have to believe that all of the other witnesses in the case were lying: the neighbors, the deputies who heard his conflicting statements, the hospital staff who documented Audrey's account, the experts who examined the scene. The jury deliberated for 5.5 hours. Sometimes, their discussions could be heard through the courtroom walls, occasionally raucous, always intense. On January 26, 2012, the 6-person jury delivered their verdict: guilty on all counts. Christopher Haney, 46-year-old former NYPD detective, was convicted of attempted first-degree murder, aggravated battery with great bodily harm, and first-degree arson. When the verdict was read, Audrey Mabrey and her family burst into tears. Haney's adult children were unable to get to the courthouse in time to hear the verdict. Justice had been served, but the sentencing was still yet to come, and that's when Audrey Mabrey would deliver one of the most powerful victim impact statements a courtroom has ever heard. On March 2, 2012, Christopher Haney returned to court for sentencing. The defense asked Judge Emmett Battles to consider the shortest possible sentence, 12 years and 6 months. Attorney Jennifer Spradley told the judge that Haney had spent his career as a law enforcement officer in New York and had even searched through the debris of the Twin Towers after the 2001 terrorist attack. But then it was Audrey's turn to speak. Audrey stood before the court and said, "In December 2009, I woke up after being in a coma for 6 weeks and felt completely lost. What I found in the mirror was devastation instantly followed by determination." She spoke about the surgeries, the therapy, the questions from her sons about why their father did this. Then she looked directly at the judge and said something that would echo through the courtroom: "I ask that the court, Your Honor, not show mercy on his earthly life, because he did not show mercy on mine." Judge Emmett Battles listened to both sides, then he delivered his ruling. Christopher Peter Haney was sentenced to life in prison for attempted first-degree murder. He also received 30 years for arson and 30 years for aggravated battery with great bodily harm. Judge Battles addressed Haney directly from the bench: "Mr. Haney, there is your victim. forever to bear the physical and emotional scars that were inflicted at your hands. It is her will to live, her strength in all of this that the court finds nothing short of amazing, but I'm struck by something else, the barbarity of these crimes, the viciousness, as cruel as this court has witnessed. The prosecution had argued, better than anyone else, this defendant should know right from wrong. Instead, he had tried to murder his wife. In an unusual move, Christopher Hanney chose to reserve his comments until after the sentence, knowing the judge would not consider them. The man in the jail jumpsuit and chains turned to his ex-wife and said he prays for her forgiveness. He told her, "You are one of the most strongest and most courageous persons I have ever known." Even after everything, he still tried to control the narrative, but Audrey had already moved on. Domestic violence experts who reviewed this case point to several critical factors. Fire as a weapon is particularly significant. It's not just about causing death, it's about causing maximum suffering. According to Audrey herself, who now studies these patterns, it is the fear of losing control that drives many abusers. Someone who feels like they have lost everything is capable of anything, and it was a last effort to have control. Christopher Hanney was facing the end of his marriage, the exposure of his gambling addiction, and the loss of his family. In his mind, if he couldn't have Audrey, no one would. The choice to use fire, to make her suffer, to disfigure, to cause lasting pain even if she survived, reveals a particular psychology. This wasn't a quick act of passion. He had to get the gasoline, get the candle, force her into the garage, beat her first with a hammer. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the most dangerous time for a victim is when they attempt to leave. Statistically, 75% of domestic violence murders happen when the victim tries to end the relationship. Looking back at the relationship, warning signs were present. Christopher Hanney had exhibited jealous, controlling behavior. He had isolated Audrey financially, and he didn't support her decision to return to school. These are classic patterns of coercive control, tactics that abusers use to maintain power over their partners. When Audrey decided to divorce him, when she took back control of her own life, Christopher saw it as a direct threat to his authority. The violence that followed wasn't about love or passion, it was about punishment. Audrey reflected on this years later. "I'm 7 years out, I'm still going through surgeries, and I still have to work my way around the sun. I still can never sweat where I've been burned, so I overheat. There's things from that injury that I'll carry forever." But she also carries something else, the knowledge that she survived, that she testified, that she helped put her attacker behind bars. Audrey Mabrey now works as an advocate for domestic violence victims through an organization called Breaking the Silence Against Domestic Violence. She has appeared on national television, sharing her story to help others recognize the warning signs of abuse and find the courage to leave. When asked about how to stop this cycle, Audrey said, "Who is out there telling these men, telling these boys that you do not have the right to take someone's life? Someone needs to tell them that. We need to reach them before they commit crimes, and someone needs to tell them, if you decide to take someone's life, really, in turn, you are going to lose yours, because it's going to be spent behind bars." Audrey credits her faith for getting her through the anguish and agony. "It is God," she says. "All God, He shines through me." She has finalized her divorce, rebuilt her life, and continues to raise her sons. Christopher Peter Hanney is currently incarcerated in the Florida prison system, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His Department of Corrections number is T76752. According to public records, he has filed no successful appeals. His prison records show he has a tattoo on his right arm with Audrey's name, a permanent reminder of the woman whose life he tried to take, but who survived to ensure he faced justice. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Audrey Mabrey's case teaches us crucial lessons about domestic violence. The warning signs were there: jealousy, controlling behavior, financial abuse, isolation from support systems, and opposition to independence. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. National Domestic Violence Hotlines showing on your screen, available 24/7, free and confidential, or text START to the number also showing on your screen. Moments after her husband was found guilty, Audrey Mabrey had a message for other victims of domestic violence. As Audrey says with resolve, She is a warrior with the heart of a mother. Her survival is not just physical, it's a testament to the power of the human spirit, to refusing to be defined by someone else's violence, and to transforming trauma into purpose. Christopher Haney tried to erase her. Instead, she became louder. This case raises important questions. How many more warnings do victims need to give before the system protects them? What does true accountability look like? And how do we reach potential abusers before they harm someone? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you know someone who needs to hear Audrey's story, please share this video. And remember, leaving an abuser is not weakness, it's the bravest thing you can do. Audrey Mabrey is proof that survivors can not only rebuild their lives, they can help save others. Subscribe for more in-depth true crime analysis that honors victims and examines the systems that failed them, and stay safe out there.